What is the equivalent word for compile in an interpreted language? In C, we say GCC compiles foo.c. For interpreters, such as Lua, what is the equivalent verb? The Lua interpreter _foo.lua. When I write instructions for users of my Lua script, I often say run the interpreter on foo.lua. I think this can be said more succinctly. Interpret, or translate, foo.lua. But that sounds awkward for some reason, perhaps because I'm unsure of its correctness. I can't really say compile because users may confuse it with the usage of the Lua compiler when I actually mean the Lua interpreter.
What about the Lua interpreter executes foo.lua? Or the Lua interpreter runs foo.lua? Seems pretty reasonable.
I would probably write Lua interprets foo.lua. But if talking to someone not versed in my particular language, I might still use compiles as I would expect that to be broadly understood.
I'm afraid that compile does not mean what you think it means. Almost all modern interpreted languages are compiled first. They just don't generate native machine code to be executed by the hardware, but rather by some sort of code, pseudocode, interpreter, or bytecode interpreter, or whatever makes sense for their representation. Thus, if you try to run a Perl program, the compiler will indicate syntax errors. If you don't get any, then the interpreter is turned loose on the resulting compiled representation. To a rough approximation, when you see compile, you should be thinking parse. And when you see interpret, you probably should be thinking execute, or perhaps even better, simply run. And code generation is something else again. Perl compiles and executes code. Or it parses it and runs it. So do many other languages.
The intermediate step between text and effect that is compiling doesn't exist in an interpreter, that's the distinction that defines the difference. You can trace the boundary with just-in-time compilation aka JIT. Whether or not a language is an interpreted one started blurring decades ago and is slowly getting blurrier. It looks to me like the distinction is inconsequential here, so I'd just say and. As Chill points out, there is no action that corresponds to compiling in an interpreted language, so in one sense, your question is meaningless. It's like asking, what's the word for claws on a goldfish? But okay, the correct term for what you want is interprets. And if you think it's awkward to say, the Lua interpreter interprets the program, then just say, Lua interprets the program. You'd have the same issue with the compiler. Sure, you could say, the C compiler compiles the program, but normally we just say, C compiles the program or we compile the C program or some such. If it's necessary to specify the Lua interpreter for some reason, then I guess you could use an alternative word that could be synonymous with interprets, like executes or processes. I'd add that while in everyday speech it's common to choose a synonym to avoid sounding repetitious, to give the sentence a certain rhythm, etc., you should be careful about this in technical writing. Many technical terms have precise meanings, and you can't just toss in a synonym because it flows better. Like, my dictionary says that drift is a synonym for float. But I think it would be a really bad idea to say, declare this variable as a drift because you've already used the word float twice in the sentence.
If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing.